On June 20th, 2021, rangers responded to a report of a backpacker suffering from heat illness on the Tonto Trail near Monument Creek. The hiker was Michelle Meter, 53, from Hudson, Ohio. She had become disoriented the day before while descending Hermit Trail. When rangers reached her, she was dead. The National Park Service said the death was believed to be heat-related. At Phantom Ranch, the temperature that day was about 115 degrees Fahrenheit. That sounds like an extreme weather story. It is not. The disturbing part is what the larger record says. In the current National Park Service mortality data, there are 48 Grand Canyon deaths coded specifically to hiking. 15 are attributed to hyperthermia. 13 are medical deaths during physical activity. 11 are falls. The thing people see first is the cliff. The thing that leads the named categories is heat. That does not prove heat is the #1 killer on the Tonto Trail itself. No Tonto-only mortality denominator exists. But heat is the strongest documented killer of Grand Canyon hikers, and it appears repeatedly in verified Tonto fatalities. That distinction matters because the Tonto can look less dangerous than it is. This channel breaks down why dangerous places kill using the actual record, so subscribe if that is the kind of explanation you want. By the end, you will understand what the Tonto Trail quietly takes away from you, and why experience does not necessarily give it back. Grand Canyon National Park is not a place where death is common in the ordinary sense. In 2025, it recorded 4,430,653 recreational visits. The park listed 11 fatalities that year. Officials have described a typical park-wide range of roughly 10 to 15 deaths annually, so the individual risk is small. But millions of visits change what small means. The current National Park Service Mortality Workbook contains 227 Grand Canyon death records beginning in 2007 and extending into early 2026. Those are park-wide records, not Tonto-specific deaths, and the more recent mortality data are still preliminary. But the overall pattern is large enough that the park maintains an extensive emergency system around it. In 2025 alone, Grand Canyon personnel handled 232 search and rescue incidents and 848 emergency medical incidents. Preventive search and rescue teams recorded 444 hiker assists and 18,400 preventive actions. Those numbers are more useful than a dramatic death count because they show how often a bad situation begins without becoming a fatal one, and heat has been driving that workload for decades. In 1996, Grand Canyon recorded 482 search and rescue incidents. 300 were heat-related. 5 people died from heat that year. In a later National Park Service analysis covering 2011 through 2013, hiker assist rates increased by 71% when maximum temperatures reached at least 95 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the scale of the problem. Not millions of reckless people. Not constant catastrophe. A very small fraction of visitors getting into trouble inside an environment that receives millions of chances each year to expose the same weaknesses. The Tonto Trail sits inside that larger system, and once you understand what makes the Tonto deceptive, the fatality numbers begin to look less random. The Grand Canyon has an unusual psychological geometry. You begin at the top. The first major movement is often down. The National Park Service explicitly warns that people are lured by the initially easy downhill portion of canyon hikes before serious illness, injury, or death develops. That is already backwards from the way your brain likes to price effort. On most walks, going down feels like progress. Here, going down also means creating a future obligation. Every foot you lose has to be dealt with later. Then the Tonto adds another trick. The trail runs across the broad Tonto platform, roughly 3,900 feet below the south rim. Compared with the steep descent above it, parts of the route can look almost merciful. The line is more horizontal. The walking can feel less dramatic. The cliffs are still there, but the immediate sensation is not always one of vertical danger. Your brain can read that as relief. Your body does not. The National Park Service warns that the Tonto segment between the tip-off and Havasupai Gardens has no water and very limited shade. Inner canyon summer temperatures can exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can be moving across terrain that looks simpler while your actual margin is shrinking. Your water margin, your temperature margin, your cardiovascular margin, your rescue margin. I keep coming back to that because it is the best way to understand the Tonto. It is a margin eater. It does not need to confront you with one enormous hazard. It can simply make the ordinary costs of walking more expensive than they look. Heat raises the cost. Distance raises the cost. A dry stretch raises the cost. The climb you still owe raises the cost. And because the trail can look manageable, your brain may continue approving the plan after the numbers underneath that plan have changed. Here is the part that should bother you. The first system heat begins to damage is not necessarily your legs. It can be your ability to decide what to do with them. Here is what the data actually says. Among the 48 Grand Canyon deaths coded specifically to hiking in the current National Park Service mortality workbook, 15 are hyperthermia. That is 31.3% of the hiking subset. 13 or 27.1% are medical deaths during physical activity. 11 or 22.9% are falls. 8 are undetermined and must stay undetermined. So the visible danger is real. It just does not lead the named categories. Heat does. Again, that is Grand Canyon hiking data, not a Tonto-only ranking. The available records do not allow a responsible claim that 31.3% of Tonto deaths are heat deaths. But the larger hiking pattern and the verified Tonto incidents point in the same direction. And the mechanism explains why. When you walk hard in heat, your muscles produce metabolic heat. Your body has to move some of that heat toward the skin and get rid of it. Sweating helps, but sweat also removes fluid. As circulating blood volume falls, your cardiovascular system has to keep supplying working muscles while also sending blood toward the skin for cooling. You are asking the same system to do two expensive jobs at once. If heat production and environmental heat overwhelm your ability to cool yourself, core temperature rises. Exertional heat stroke can progress beyond exhaustion into neurological dysfunction, systemic inflammation, abnormal clotting, and injury to multiple organs. The National Park Service points to altered mental status as the critical dividing line. Confusion, poor judgment, inability to cope, unconsciousness, seizures. That list matters because people often imagine heat danger as thirst, fatigue, and then collapse. The more unsettling version is that the person making decisions can deteriorate before the person stops moving. Grand Canyon medical research adds scale to that mechanism. From 2004 through 2009, researchers identified 474 non-fatal heat-related illness cases and 6 fatal heat-related cases. About 90% of the non-fatal cases occurred while hiking. This is not an edge case, and it is not solved by one simplistic instruction like, drink more water. Grand Canyon guidance also warns about hyponatremia, where excessive water intake combined with salt loss can drive blood sodium dangerously low. Severe cases can involve altered consciousness and seizures. Heat management is a balance problem. That is why the Tonto is more complicated than a hot trail. The environment is changing the chemistry, circulation, and judgment of the person who has to decide whether the plan is still safe. Michelle Mater's death is useful here because it shows how little drama the mechanism requires. She was 53, on a multi-day backpacking trip from Hermit toward Bright Angel. On June 19, 2021, she became disoriented while descending Hermit Trail and later became unconscious. At about 1:15 the next afternoon, an emergency report concerned a backpacker suffering heat illness on the Tonto Trail near Monument Creek. Rangers determined that she was dead. The National Park Service said the death was believed to be heat-related. The temperature at Phantom Ranch that day was about 115 degrees Fahrenheit. There is no need to add anything to that record. No invented last words. No theory about what she was thinking. No cinematic final decision. The physiology is enough. At extreme heat, every minute of exertion creates metabolic heat that still has to go somewhere. Sweating can cool you, but it reduces circulating fluid. Lower blood volume raises the strain on the cardiovascular system. Meanwhile, the skin still needs blood flow for cooling, and the muscles still need blood flow for movement. The body starts spending from the same account in several places, and when that account gets too low, heat illness does not remain a comfort problem. It can become a brain problem, a circulation problem, and eventually a multi-organ problem. That is why "I still feel capable of walking" is not a medical clearance. The National Park Service found that hiker assist rates jumped 71% once maximum temperatures reached at least 95 degrees. The inner canyon can exceed 110. Meter's Day reached about 115 at Phantom Ranch. The gap between those numbers is not trivial. It is a different operating environment, and the more experienced you are, the easier it can be to assume that ordinary hiking signals still mean what they usually mean. Sometimes they do. Sometimes the heat has changed the meaning. The second major category is less visually satisfying and more personal. 13 of the 48 Grand Canyon hiking deaths, 27.1%, are coded as medical deaths during physical activity. That category does not mean 13 heart attacks. The data do not support that claim. But the interaction between exertion and heat is clear. Heat stress increases cardiac workload. Sweating promotes dehydration and electrolyte loss. Falling circulating volume means the cardiovascular system has less fluid to work with while the demands of walking continue. At the same time, blood is being directed toward the skin to help remove heat. Your heart does not get to opt out because the trail looks flat. This is what almost nobody packs for. You can carry water, food, shade, navigation, and an emergency device. You cannot place a spare cardiovascular system in the bottom of the pack. That does not mean a medical collapse is inevitable or that every hiker has a hidden condition. It means the canyon can become a stress multiplier. The same act that feels ordinary elsewhere, sustained walking, occurs here under heat, fluid loss, distance, and delayed access to help. The numbers should change how you think about environmental deaths. A fall obviously belongs to the landscape. A medical collapse looks like it belongs to the person. On the Tonto, that boundary is not clean. The environment loads the body responds, and if the response fails, the cause may be filed as medical even though the canyon helped set the terms. The next danger is the one everybody expects, and that is exactly why it can distract you from the others. Falls account for 11 of the 48 Grand Canyon hiking deaths in the current dataset, or 22.9%. That is not a small number. A sufficiently long fall produces high-energy, blunt trauma. Fatal falls commonly involve major skeletal and internal injuries. And on remote terrain, a non-fatal fall can create a second emergency by immobilizing someone in heat while evacuation is delayed. So the cliffs deserve respect, but they also dominate the imagination. You look at exposure and instinctively understand the rule. Do not fall. It is clean, visible, immediate. Heat gives you no equivalent edge to stand back from. There is no painted line where thermoregulation fails. There is no obvious drop where cardiac workload becomes too high. There is no single step that tells you your judgment has started degrading. That is why the ranking matters. The 11 fall deaths are real, but they sit behind 15 hyperthermia deaths and 13 medical deaths during physical activity in the hiking subset. And 8 more hiking deaths remain undetermined rather than being forced into a cleaner story. Good data is sometimes less dramatic than the canyon. That is the point. The danger you can see is only part of the bill. Lightning appears once in the 48 hiking deaths, or 2.1%. It is a real mechanism and a rare one in this dataset. A lightning strike can disrupt the cardiovascular and nervous systems, producing lethal heart rhythms or injuring the brain's respiratory control. But there is no verified Tonto-specific fatal lightning incident in the dossier strong enough to build a story around, so it stays where the data puts it. Small. That restraint matters. A danger channel earns trust by refusing to inflate the rare hazard just because it looks good on screen. And once you stop inflating the rare hazards, the ordinary ones become harder to ignore. This is where the categories stop behaving like separate boxes. Heat increases fluid loss. Fluid loss increases cardiovascular strain. Cardiovascular strain makes sustained exertion more expensive. Heat can also impair judgment. A navigation decision, pacing decision, or water decision that would normally be recoverable can become more costly after hours of exposure. A fall that would otherwise be survivable can become more dangerous if it leaves you immobilized in extreme heat. A medical problem becomes more serious when extraction is slow. The risks stack. That is why I call the Tonto a margin eater. Every hour can remove a little more of what lets you correct mistakes. Water, cooling capacity, physical reserve, clear judgment, time, and the trail does not need to remove all of them. It only needs to remove enough that the next ordinary problem arrives after your ability to absorb it has gone. The verified numbers keep pointing in that direction. 15 hyperthermia deaths in the hiking subset, 13 medical deaths during physical activity, 11 falls. In 1996, 300 heat-related search and rescue incidents. In later NPS analysis, a 71% increase in hiker assists once maximum temperatures reached at least 95 degrees. Those are separate statistics describing the same basic pressure. The environment makes errors more expensive. If you have ever continued a hike because you still felt basically fine, tell me in the comments. And if this is changing how you think about a Grand Canyon trip, leave a like, because the darker part is not what the heat does to your body. It is what it can do to the person deciding whether to keep going. The National Park Service describes a recurring intercanyon problem in simple terms. Visitors underestimate the difficulty and overestimate their ability to cope with the environment. That is not an insult. It is a human calibration error. You begin with information your brain understands: distance, elevation, water, temperature, your own experience. Then the canyon changes the value of those inputs as the day progresses. The descent feels easier than the climb you will owe later. The Tonto feels more horizontal than the trail that brought you down. A body that was strong at the rim is now 3,900 feet below it in an environment where summer temperatures can exceed 110 degrees, and while you are recalculating all of that, dehydration can impair the calculator. A meta-analysis cited in the dossier found that dehydration beyond about 2% of body mass can impair attention, executive function, and motor coordination. That is not a Tonto-specific finding, but it explains why Grand Canyon guidance treats confusion and poor judgment as serious heat stroke signs rather than personality flaws. Your brain does not stand outside the emergency. It is part of the system being stressed. That is what makes the usual advice to know when to turn around more complicated than it sounds. Turning around is a decision. Pacing is a decision. Rationing effort is a decision. Recognizing that the plan has failed is a decision. The person most affected has to identify that they are affected. There is another trap here, and it has nothing to do with gift shops or paved paths. The Tonto is genuine backcountry. The misread comes from terrain that can look manageable compared with the descent above it. Your eyes say horizontal. Your physiology says heat load. Your map says distance. Your remaining water says something else. Experienced people are not exempt from miscalibration. Experimental climbing research cited in the dossier found that risk perception could decrease during activity while errors increased, with more experienced participants showing lower perceived risk in that study. That research was not conducted on the Tonto, so it cannot be used to diagnose Tonto hikers. But it does support a narrower point. Experience changes risk perception. It does not abolish risk. Here is what almost nobody accounts for. Competence can help you manage a dangerous environment, but it can also make an ordinary sensation of control feel like evidence that the environment is still inside your normal range. The Tonto does not care how persuasive that feeling is. This is where it gets worse. Even if you recognize the problem correctly, the canyon does not pause while help is organized. In 2025, Grand Canyon personnel handled 232 search and rescue incidents, 848 emergency medical incidents, and 444 preventive hiker assists. Those are park-wide numbers, but they explain why rescue resources cannot be treated like a private service waiting for one person. The National Park Service explicitly warns intercanyon hikers that assistance can be delayed by limited staffing, simultaneous rescue calls, responder safety requirements, and limited helicopter capability during extreme heat or bad weather. It tells hikers to be prepared for self-rescue because immediate assistance may not be available. Read that again in practical terms. The same heat making you sicker can make aircraft operations harder. The same terrain making you difficult to reach is also the terrain rescuers have to enter. And the same park dealing with your emergency may already be dealing with another one. Flight time is not rescue time. The clock begins before an aircraft can ever reach you. An emergency has to be recognized. It has to be communicated. Your location has to be established well enough for responders to act. Rangers have to decide what kind of response can reach you without creating another emergency. At the same time, other calls may already be consuming staff or aviation resources. That is why the National Park Service warning about self-rescue matters so much. It is not saying rescue does not exist. Grand Canyon recorded 232 search and rescue incidents in 2025, plus 848 emergency medical incidents. It is saying the system has physical limits. There were also 444 preventive hiker assists and 18,400 preventive actions that year. Those numbers represent the other side of rescue, trying to interrupt the chain before a person becomes a patient, and the chain can move faster than the response. Grand Canyon search and rescue averaged roughly $1 million a year in the late 1990s, but there is no verified current park-wide annual cost in the dossier, so there is no honest modern number to give you. The useful number is 232 rescue incidents in 1 year. Help exists. It is highly capable. But capability is not immediacy. And on a trail that is already spending your physiological margin, time is not neutral. The title of this video says experienced hikers. The data requires a careful correction. The National Park Service mortality dataset does not consistently record hiking experience. So there is no honest statistic proving that experienced hikers are the group who usually die on the Tonto. What the data does show is that the victims are not confined to one cartoon category. Among the 48 Grand Canyon hiking fatality records, 36 are male, 11 female, and 1 does not report sex. That makes the hiking subset 75% male. The largest age group is 55 to 64, with 14 deaths. 10 more are 35 to 44, and 6 are 45 to 54. Altogether, 30 of the 48 hiking deaths, 62.5% fall between 35 and 64. Those figures are park-wide hiking data, not Tonto-only demographics. The heat illness research is broader still. From 2004 through 2009, researchers identified 474 non-fatal heat-related cases and 6 fatal ones at Grand Canyon, with about 90% of the non-fatal cases occurring during hiking. So there is no clean profile that lets you say, I am not that person. And one verified Tonto case makes the fitness point particularly difficult to dismiss. On July 8, 2004, a 24-year-old Chicago runner identified in the source as MLB and a companion began a day run down Grandview Trail. Their plan was to cross the Tonto Plateau and return by South Kaibab, a reported 27-mile circuit. They carried 5 quarts of water between them and ran out during the afternoon. They separated. MLB attempted to descend toward Phantom Ranch for water and assistance. Her body was later found in Cremation Creek, between the Tonto Trail and the Colorado River, roughly 1,000 feet below the trail. The report says she had negotiated 3 dry waterfalls and apparently became stranded above a 4th. Phantom Ranch reached 105 degrees that day. The medical examiner determined that the accidental death was caused by dehydration due to environmental heat exposure. The National Park Service report described her as being in excellent physical condition. It noted a Boston Marathon time of 3 hours and 5 minutes and said she was in northern Arizona for high-altitude training. That does not prove fitness is a risk factor. It proves fitness is not immunity, and that is the detail I cannot get past. If your identity is built around being capable, there may be no obvious moment when the Tonto announces that your usual capability is no longer enough. The Tonto Trail is not malicious. It does not select the inexperienced, punish the confident, or wait for one spectacular mistake. It just keeps charging the same price. Heat, distance, dry ground, cardiovascular strain, time. The margin gets smaller until an error that would normally be recoverable is not. What stays with me is not the 11 fall deaths. It is that hyperthermia leads the named hiking categories with 15, because the most visible danger is not necessarily the one doing the most work. The canyon as a whole received more than 4.4 million visits in 2025 and recorded 11 fatalities. Most people go home. The environment remains indifferent either way. Which mechanism surprised you most, and which dangerous place should I break down next? Subscribe if you want the real reasons these places kill, not the version that makes the easiest headline.